We're pleased to have Cody Jones from the Basement team on with us this evening. And Cody's recently produced an article which really develops this idea of what the Chinese mission, which is currently ongoing to mine Helium-3 from the moon, what this really means in terms of a complete transformation, as Lyndon LaRouche has been discussing this, of what value is. LaRouche recently pointed out that there's been a complete inversion of values from the speculative system of bailouts of financial derivatives completely collapsing in value, being something which has negative value, as opposed to that which is replacing that former notion of value, which is what's typified by the breakthrough with the BRICS development bank orientation, but more emphatically the horizon, which really is a horizon. It's something that is undergoing sort of a development and is really still a question of how it's going to be done. But the use, the potential use of mining Helium-3 from the moon, which it's been estimated is a source of power for 10,000 years. When you think about 10,000 years, going back 10,000 years, and where mankind would have been at that point, the idea of a 10,000-year source of power, which is much hotter than the sun, obviously covers a span of time which gets to the question of man's long-term survival, to say the least. But just to say one more thing before we bring Cody on here, it's frankly very notable that this breakthrough, which is the most dramatic scientific and political economic breakthrough really in a long time, very, very long time, if not completely unique in mankind's history, and that this hasn't been reported. It simply has not been reported to the American people, and you can ask the question, why has it not been reported to the American people? And you can think about the development of the United States putting a man on the moon and the type of impact and optimism and sort of American spirit that generated throughout the rest of the world, and how that transformed mankind's potential. And then, think about the question of why this is not being treated in such a way that the American population can actually realize the tremendous breakthrough that this represents. So I give you Cody Jones.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Hello, everybody there in Detroit. So, yes, as Bill said, people are not being given the truth. And so what I'd like to do is get into what's really going on. Now, as Bill indicated, you do have a process underway globally where one system is collapsing while another system is rising. And in that process of one system collapsing and the other rising, you're seeing a total inversion of the popular idea of what value is. That everything that up to this point, or at least has been the dominant system over the last 40, 50 plus years, the idea of value within that system is now being eliminated. So the idea that your stocks on Wall Street have some real value is going away. The idea that this nearly $1 quadrillion in derivatives that exist on the international markets, that has some kind of value, is going away. Those things which have been put forward as the essence of our economy, as the backbone of our economy, namely all these financial instruments, including the actual paper dollars themselves, are now going out the window. And going out the window with them is the whole set of values associated with that. Replacing it is a new system, a system which places value on that which is of physical necessity for the future. That value is no longer to be determined by simple desires and a simple want to maintain the status quo, but instead value is now being defined in terms of what is necessary and what is sufficient to produce a viable future for the human species. At the center of that is this discussion around the mining and utilization of helium-3, a chemical isotope, something which in and of itself is, as we've discussed, an inert gas with very little use other than for fusion power. But I'll get into that a bit more in just a moment. What I'd like to first do is to just give more of a sense of what this switch is. What's going on the collapsing side? This would be the transatlantic system, the London Wall Street dominated monetary system as the one which is collapsing, and this new emerging system, which is something which is centered around these BRICS agreements. This is BRICS represents the countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who have, over the last couple of years, have had a number of summits, which, you know, to be honest, in its founding was somewhat dubious as to what its intention was. And in fact, our movement itself was critical of the BRICS as it was originally formed and constituted. Because as it initially came together, this BRICS agreement was really just part of a continuation or extension of the London Wall Street monetarist system, where a lot of this was going to be used to bring Brazil and others into this whole carry trade process, which is just a fancy process of basically borrowing money from one place and using it to buy currency in another country where you could realize some profit through the margin in exchange and other crazy speculative finance. But what's happened is that in the wake of the reality of what we're seeing in the world, of a breakdown of the London Wall Street monetary system, with the physical breakdown that's going on globally in terms of food supplies, energy supplies, the water crisis, you name it. Faced with that reality, these BRICS nations completely turn the tables on that initial impulse of just being an organization for speculative finance, and instead have become a group of nations organized around the defense of national sovereignty and the promotion of nation building, the promotion of the development of the whole of humanity, realized through massive investment in infrastructure and front-end technology. And so what you had coming out of the most recent summit, which took place in Brazil, actually it took place right after, as the World Cup was fading and all that hoopla was going away, they held this summit in Brazil. And probably the most important thing that came out of that summit among these nations, you had Putin, you had the leaders of all the nations there in Brazil, was that they formed what's called the New Development Bank. And what this is a bank which will initially be constituted of about $100 billion. And what they've said is that this bank is being set up with the explicit intention to be used as a lending mechanism for large-scale infrastructure projects around the globe. That this bank would play the role that the World Bank and IMF were intended to play whenever they were originally created at Bretton Woods. You know, initially those institutions were set up to be lending mechanisms to finance large development projects in the post-World War II era. And the idea, particularly as Roosevelt, who was really the guy who initiated this idea, this Bretton Woods agreements, was to take the massive industrial buildup that had occurred in the United States in our war to defeat fascism. We had built up the greatest industrial machine the world had ever seen. And Roosevelt's idea, as was explicitly stated by his son in a book called As He Saw It, or As I Saw It, which documents his travels with his father, Roosevelt's idea was to take this massive industrial machine which had been built up and to transform it into a mechanism, to transform it into a driver for global development. To do, as he explicitly said, to end the system of empire once and for all. And to do things such as he was quoted as saying, make the deserts bloom in places like Africa. To turn the deserts of Africa into blooming gardens, into massive agricultural fields. Obviously, people who have been awake for the last 20 or 30 years know what, in fact, the IMF and World Bank have really become, which they've become mechanisms to enslave nations, to make them debt slaves to the international monetary system, and then use that debt as leverage to force these nations into selling off any kind of industry they had, to opening up their markets to looting, and basically have just opened themselves up to a process of monetary genocide through monetarism. So this new bank that came out of this BRICS agreement is created to, in effect, de facto replace the IMF World Bank system on the international stage, and to be a real bank for the lending of credit to finance large-scale infrastructure and development projects. And that's the direction they're moving in. Now, in conjunction with that, you had on the sideline of the BRICS summits a number of nation-to-nation agreements, where Russia set up agreements with South Africa, for example, for the development and trade of components for nuclear power reactors. You have the ongoing agreements between Argentina, who is not officially a BRICS nation, but was a heavy participant in this summit, where China is sending a lot of locomotives and high-speed rail components to Argentina to build up their infrastructure. And so you have these kinds of agreements going on among these nations around real nation-building, a real nation-building prospect. So this is what's emerging. Now, in the midst of that same process, you've had these attempts on the part of the London Wall Street system to try to bully the rest of the world into backing down, into capitulating to the London Wall Street system, and to move them away from any kind of alternative. So, for example, you have what's been going on in Argentina, which is a real case study in the way a nation can act in its self-defense against these speculative vultures. So people may have seen these stories on the website. We've been developing this. But Argentina, about a decade ago, went through a kind of bankruptcy, and they went through a bankruptcy reorganization. They were under the weight of a lot of debt, and they were defaulting on that debt. They couldn't pay it. This was largely debt that was organized through institutions like the IMF, and it was unjust, the amount of debt that was placed upon them. But nonetheless, out of this, about 98% of the people who were the creditors reached agreements with Argentina, where Argentina would pay some fraction of, some pennies on the dollar of their debt, and they settled their debts. But for a couple of institutions, a couple of what are known as vulture funds. And these vulture funds said, no, we're not going to get into these agreements. We want the full payment. We want face value for these debts. Now, many of these vulture funds were not even the original creditors. They bought the debt from the original creditor themselves at pennies on the dollar, and then turned around to Argentina and demanded, we want full face value. What the Argentinians said is that you're not going to get it. If we were to pay this as you're demanding, it would mean killing our people. And we are not going to kill our people to feed your debt. And so a large fight ensued, and now you've got the thing is kind of tied up in the courts. But you've had the Kirchner government has been standing strong and saying, we will not capitulate to Wall Street. We will not kill our people so that you guys can make your 1,000% profit. And so I'd like to give a sense of exactly what the sentiment is coming out of places like Argentina. Just read a quote from a recent speech that Christina Kirchner gave, responding to a group of youth addressing this whole crisis, where she said, quote, The fight against speculative capital, the vulture funds, is not only Argentina's problem, it is the world's problem. And then she went on to say, the attempt today by the vulture funds to crush Argentina, quote, has happened to African countries, it happened to Peru, it is happening also to a lot of countries in Europe. We just learned not long ago that France, also a developed nation, just fined these vulture funds for having speculated on stock sales. France, no less. Quote, as we see, the world is beginning to wake up, and it will wake up, because there is no other solution. Either we wake up, arouse ourselves, open our eyes, and basically exercise our rights. We are not discussing empty flag waving, but a nation with rights, because we have the right to grow. We have the right for our people to live well. We have to have the right for young people to study. We have to have the right for our workers to earn good salaries, to have health care, housing, so that they do not have to emigrate to another country because their country leaves them with no opportunities. And she goes on in that vein to this group of young people. So she's making the point. We will stand strong to defend our national interest, which is our right as a sovereign nation. And she's being backed up. There's a lot of support coming from nations around the world, from Peru, from Italy, from nations throughout Africa, China, Russia, all the BRICS nations are saying, we've got your back on this, Argentina. And so here you see a situation where the attempt on the part of the London Wall Street money system to back Argentina into a corner, to crush it, to loot it and crush it, has actually produced the opposite effect of what they intended. Instead of crushing Argentina and putting them into an isolated corner and making them an example to the world of what happens when you stand up against Wall Street, the whole thing backfired. And instead, you've got a movement of solidarity behind Argentina, and they've been able to make a statement in the defense of national sovereignty. And so it really is indicative of the fact that you do have a sea change underway, which is something which, honestly, has only been possible to occur, has only been made possible in the recent period. You know, had they attempted to do something like this 10 years ago, even 8 years ago, they would have had nowhere else to turn. No other nations were in a position to actually support a movement against London and Wall Street. Though there's a lot of hate for London and Wall Street, they were the sole dominators of the global system. But now that is changing. You see that similarly with what's going on with Russia, where, right, Obama has taken this big stance against the big bad bear, Putin, and said we're going to sanction Putin for coming into the Ukraine to try to clean up the mess that we started. So they imposed these sanctions on Russia. And, Obama gave this speech saying, this is going to damage the Russian economy. Russia doesn't produce anything. Mocking them, saying they've got a life expectancy of only 60 years. Russia's nothing. This is going to bury them. Well, what's been the actual result? The result is that with the sanctions, as the Russians warned, they're actually hurting Europe more than they're hurting Russia. Right? You had these figures that came out, maybe it was the beginning of this week, showing that Russia, despite what the predictions had been, actually had a growth, though a small growth, did have growth in its GDP around 2%, while the European nations had zero growth. Now, not only this, but now you've got a situation where a number of European nations are starting to revolt against these sanctions on Russia because it's closing off a lot of their markets and is really damaging their economy. You've got the situation where they've just been discussing the fact that there's millions of tons of fruits and vegetables that are basically sitting idle, rotting in Europe, that were intended to be exported to Russia, but because of these sanctions, the export channels were closed, and now that food is just rotting and going to waste. Farmers are going broke. Farmers are going bankrupt. You've had the Hungarian Prime Minister and the Czechoslovakian Prime Minister both coming out in the recent period saying these sanctions are insane. We can't go along with this. This is killing us. This is crippling our economy, not Russia's economy. You had Iceland already has broken from these sanction agreements, say we're not going to do this. This is insane. Meanwhile, the Russians have said, hey, you don't want our goods, you want to close us off, we'll open up, we'll orient towards the east. You don't want our natural gas, we've got plenty of markets in Asia. The Chinese want this stuff. And so as a result, you've seen these new agreements emerging between the Egyptians and the Russians for wheat sales from Russia into Egypt. You've got agreements going on between Egypt and China around food agreements. And so, as well as you've also had these recent agreements, which will become more relevant in a minute as we get into some of the aspects of the Helium-3 and some of the science, where Russia has just now signed an agreement with China to start to import high-end electrical components and circuitry to be used in their rockets. This is stuff they had been getting from the United States because Russia's been having some problems in their own production of these kinds of components. They had been getting from the United States, but now, because of the sanctions, they've been cut off. They said, fine, we'll get them from China. And in the meantime, this has led us to realize that, hey, we shouldn't be relying on anybody in this aspect. We're going to develop our own internal economy in this regard. This is actually pushing Russia to say we're going to start to invest in our own front-end science and technology. So it's actually strengthening Russia, strengthening the alliance among the nations of Asia and Eurasia, the BRICS nations, and having the absolute opposite effect of what was intended by London and Wall Street. And so you've got a situation politically which is very much akin to the kind of situation we talk about with what happens when an airplane is going through a shock wave. Like, people may have heard some of these anecdotal stories of what happens, but as an airplane starts approaching the speed of sound and is moving through the sound barrier, you get the formation of a shock wave, and these certain types of instabilities form. And literally, the plane does now the opposite of everything that the controls were intended to do. So you pull up, and the thing nosedives down. You try to, use your rudder one way, it moves you the other way, and the whole thing is now doing and acting in a complete opposite way than what you intended at your controls. And that's in fact what's happening with London and Wall Street. Everything they're doing, like what they have been trying to do to Argentina, like what they're trying to do to Russia with these sanctions, is actually having the opposite effect of what their intention was. And so the world is going through this kind of shock front type of process, but the West is living in a completely different world. The West still thinks things work one way, but the reality is the world works a completely different way. And this is what we need to get into. Now, just one other point that Mr. LaRouche thought was incredibly important that's just coming out in the last days is what's happening with Egypt and certain steps that Sisi is taking towards developing their own internal economy, sort of in line with the kinds of things we're seeing along with these BRICS nations. So you had Sisi announcing that they're going to build a new Suez Canal, one which will be much wider and much deeper, and which will facilitate the movement of very large ships through that area. Now, the important thing is he gave the speech, I think, on the 5th of August, and within a week they already were moving with this thing. They're already digging up the dirt. They had the trucks there. They had the backhoes there. They were already starting to break ground on this project. Literally announced it one day, a week later, they're already moving on this thing. Now, the significance of what they're doing is, one, yes, it's a large infrastructure project. It's going to make trade, ocean-faring trade, a lot easier through this area. But it's the way they're doing it, which is really, I think, the most important thing, is that, one, the whole thing is being organized top-down by the Egyptian equivalent of the Army Corps of Engineers. So it's being run as a national project, but is using Egyptian companies, and only Egyptian companies. That's one of the stipulations. Only Egyptian companies are going to be contracted to carry this out. Two, it's going to be financed by bonds that are sold by Egyptian banks only, and only Egyptian citizens can purchase the bonds. So the whole thing is being organized through a kind of national banking system in Egypt, wholly financed by the Egyptian population and built by Egyptian firms employing Egyptian workers. So that really, I mean, I think it's starting to set the tone for the kinds of things that the world could do and should do, right? This is a real nation-building perspective. Now, they also made the point that it's not simply just going to be the canal, but they're also going to then be building a whole development corridor around this canal. And the guy that Sisi has cited as the father of this idea is a guy named Farouk El-Baz, who's in fact someone who we've interviewed a number of times in EIR and has been someone that we've had an ongoing correspondence with around this idea of development corridors. Now, the development corridor itself is going to include nuclear power facilities, other types of manufacturing and things, and that will be opened up to contracts from other regional nations as part of a broader development perspective. So that gives you a sense of kind of where the world is going. The world is going with something like an American system style of economic model. The idea of long-term, low-interest credit lent through some sort of a national banking or at least a development bank type structure, and lent as credit specifically for the purpose of large infrastructure projects, development projects. And that's the perspective. That's where the world is going. You know, and you compare this to what's been happening here with, for example, the drought in California, Texas, and throughout the entire western part of the United States. What's actually been the response? Nothing. I mean, the response is just, you know, let's pull the same old conservation tricks out of the bag. You know, you can only water your lawn so many hours a week, and you can only do this and that, and, you know, use recyclable diapers, and, you know, just nonsense. Nothing's being done to deal with this real existential crisis that the nation is facing, where we're losing our food supply, right? Our ability to grow food, our ability to maintain cattle herds. This stuff is gone. We're losing it. We're losing our ability to support not only our people, but those others who depend on that food. So that's where we're going versus where the rest of the world is going. Now, as I said, and Mr. LaRouche is making the point, the whole thing hinges on the development and utilization of Helium-3. So what does that mean? What are we talking about with Helium-3? Helium-3 will be explicitly used for the purpose of fusion power, the generation of fusion energy. So I'd like to just, before I get into some of how that's taking shape in terms of what China's doing, what Russia and others are doing in that vein, I'll just go a little bit into exactly what is Helium-3, what's the virtue of it, and why is it so important, and why are we promoting it in particular? Why are we promoting a Helium-3 platform? So let's go to this image here. Hopefully that's something which people can all see. So what you hear is you have the most predominant reactions that are attempted to be utilized to produce fusion energy. So fusion energy is whenever you take the nuclei of two different atoms and you bring them together, and in their fusing, they release a tremendous amount of energy in the form of some sort of shooting off particle or electromagnetic radiation. Most of it's in the release of very energetic particles. So up to this point, for the main areas where they're testing to develop fusion power, they've been using some either deuterium-tritium reactions or deuterium-deuterium reactions. And those are just isotopes of hydrogen, which means, like all hydrogen, they have one proton, but depending on the number of neutrons, you get a different isotope. So deuterium, for example, has one proton, one neutron. Tritium has one proton and two neutrons. So whenever you bring together deuterium and tritium, they fuse and they transform into a very high energy neutron and a helium-4. So you're getting a fusing of the nucleus to get this helium-4, which has 2 protons and 2 neutrons. And then you're releasing the additional neutron, which flies off with a tremendous amount of energy. As we have marked there, 17.6 mega electron volts, which is, I don't know what the scale is there, but it's, it's a very energetic particle. Now, if you go down and see the bottom two, there we're dealing with helium. And helium-3 is an isotope of helium in which it has 2 protons and only 1 neutron, whereas the more abundant helium, helium-4, has 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Now, whenever you bring together helium-3 to fuse it, what's released, the most important thing that's released, are these positive, you see in the green there, these positive hydrogen or protons, really. They're just positive protons are released, which are also highly energetic. And you see in the case of the fourth one there, the deuterium-helium, the energy released is even more than you get with the deuterium-tritium. But the important thing is not the amount of energy per se that's released. All of these are, tens of millions of times more energetic in terms of the density of energy released per amount of fuel, are 10 million times more energetic than what you get from coal or oil or any kind of fossil fuel. So all of these are going to produce a lot of energy, relatively speaking. But the important thing about the use of helium-3, is that proton that's released, where you can see the difference. With the helium-3 reactions, you're releasing a proton as your main energetic product, whereas with the deuterium and tritium reactions, your main product is a neutron. So what's the significance of that? Well, a neutron, as the name implies, has a neutral charge. So whenever you're using these plasmas in a tokamak, for example, and you can see behind me this is a picture of the plasma inside of a tokamak. A tokamak is a fusion reactor design that comes out of Russia, and basically it's a donut-shaped design, and you have a plasma inside that donut. It's confined by magnets. So you're using magnets and an electrical induction to create a magnetic field, which is then holding this plasma, and then it's being heated up to over 100 times the temperature of the sun. We're talking about 100 million degrees is how hot this plasma gets. Now, sort of the mechanics behind what they think is going on, or what they're attempting to do for fusion, is basically just get this gas so hot that these isotopes, well, they get stripped away. When it gets hot enough, these elements, they lose their electrons. The electrons get stripped off, and you're left with a bunch of free-ranging negatively charged electrons, and then a bunch of free-ranging positively charged nuclei. And these things are moving around because it's so hot, they're moving so fast, and the idea is that some percentage of these things are going to collide with each other and fuse. So as these things are all whipping around, you get it hot enough, you get enough kinetic movement going on, and these things are going to start bombarding and crashing into each other and fusing, and then releasing off these neutrons. Now, maybe we can get into some of the science. There's this sort of the brute force approach to fusion. Basically just using high temperature, high pressure to get these things going, and basically just using a statistical analysis of how hot you need it to get, how much pressure you need in order to get a number of reactions which will give you above break even, meaning that you're going to be producing more energy out than you're having to put into it. And that's the ultimate goal. Can you produce more energy than you put in, so that this is actually a real, it's an economically viable source of energy? So when this is happening with deuterium and tritium, these neutrons are flying off with tremendous amounts of energy, pretty much in random directions. So what you do is you're then surrounding the tokamak with what they call a blanket. And effectively, this blanket absorbs these high-energy neutrons and transforms it into just radiant heat. That heat is then used to heat up steam or some other gas to drive a turbine and produce electricity, the old-fashioned way, so to speak. So basically, the only place where it's any different is that the heat itself is coming from fusion. But the way in which you're then using that energy is pretty much the way that you use the heat energy that comes off of out of a coal plant or anything like that. Now these neutrons are, as I said, very energetic, and they're also very reactive. So over time, they start to damage the walls of your reactor, and you have to replace the walls, and there's different things they're trying to do to line the walls with lithium that might be able to absorb these neutrons, and it's a real engineering challenge to figure out how to deal with these very energetic neutrons that are flying off all over the place, harness them, and use them in an efficient way. And we've been making some pretty good progress in that direction, both in terms of the actual engineering of the type of design you would want to use, but also just more importantly, understanding how the plasmas themselves work. And as a side note, we're now getting to the point where we're starting to understand this more and more, getting away from just this pure statistical kinematic approach to fusion and starting to understand some of the properties of these plasmas, where they start to go towards a kind of self-organization process, where you create the conditions properly, where the thing starts to organize itself, to contain itself, to create densities of activity. And that's kind of the direction we ultimately want to go in terms of the research, is how do we actually utilize the natural tendencies of the plasma to get the fusion out of it. But that aside, that's been the challenge. These neutrons, what do we do with them? How do we use them? And as I said, pretty much you're just going to use them for the heat that they produce, at least at this point. So here's where the advantage comes in whenever you're carrying out fusion using helium-3. The fact that the reaction products are charged, these charged protons, means that they can be controlled and directed using magnetic fields. Neutrons can't. They're neutral. They have no charge. Magnetic fields have no effect on them. These protons now, you can now start to direct the flow of these electrons, which has a number of great advantages. One, you can start to use it for direct energy conversion, where basically you run the stream of charged particles through some sort of a magnetic field, and you can create electricity through induction. So you're running these high charged particles through some other type of device, which is then creating a magnetic flux, and that then in turn is producing electricity. And so when you use this direct conversion of charged particles to produce electricity, they calculate that they'll probably get about 70% efficiency in terms of the amount of energy that's going into that process versus what you're able to capture and harness and is usable. So about 70% efficiency, which is very good, because even at this point, even nuclear reactors, coal-firing plants, and others have about a 40% efficiency. And so you're talking about an increase of 30% more efficient using this type of thing. So that's one advantage. The other thing is that by controlling the flow of these protons, you can also start to direct them for machining, using something like a particle beam laser, proton beams that can be used for manufacturing, for cutting, for processing. So there's a lot of uses there. You now have a very high energy particle beam technology which can be directed and applied in ways which you can't do, and you can achieve things which you can't do with lower level technologies. So you have that advantage. You now are able to use the product of the fusion reactant itself as a tool, and there's papers written on this where this can really revolutionize the whole manufacturing and production process. The other use of these particle beams, these proton beams, is for surgery, for precision surgery. Probably the most important area, at least now that's being discussed, is to utilize these for brain cancers, where you can have very targeted, basically destruction of cell-by-cell targeting of cancer cells in the brain, for example, and create virtually no or very little collateral damage. So where now certain areas where if you have a cancer in certain areas of the brain under current slash and cut types of surgeries, you just can't do it. You'll kill the patient. To get to the cancer to carry out the extraction is just too risky, and in all likelihood you're actually going to kill the patient. But now with this kind of technology applied for medical uses, you can do precision targeting of individual cells and are now able to achieve medical functions which were literally impossible under the current regime of activity. So there's a tremendous number of other spin-off uses from this kind of fusion which otherwise don't exist under the deuterium-tritium type reactions. Now the other thing, which is perhaps most important in the long run, or will become most important in the long run, is the way that these directed beams can be used for propulsion systems, for space propulsion systems. So that because of your ability to control and direct the flow of these protons, you can now use what's known as a magnetic bottle. And this is something, the designs for this are being worked out, have been pretty thoroughly developed by a guy named Franklin Chang Diaz, who's a former NASA astronaut who actually we've done some interviews with in our 21st century. And he's developed a engine which uses magnets, magnetic fields, and magnetic confinement to direct the flow of very high temperature electrically charged plasmas and things like protons. And so with that, you're now developing a technology which it gives you a very long-living engine because you don't have any kind of moving parts. Nothing is actually touching, none of the material, the hot material, the fuel is actually touching the engine because it's all contained by magnetic fields, so you have no wear and tear on the engine, you have no heating of the engine in that way. There's no moving parts because it's all just creating electrical and pressure differences between the charged particles and the plasma, so everything's flowing based off of differential changes. But most importantly, it now gives you an ability to start to move towards things like one-gravity accelerated flight. What that means is that ideally you'd like to get towards being able to have constant acceleration as opposed to just blasting off now. Right now we have very high thrust rockets, like we have with the Saturn V rockets, or like they're developing with this next SLS rocket, which use chemical fuels. You get a lot of thrust, a lot of specific impulse to lift this thing, to get out of the gravity field, to lift it and throw it up into space. But once these rockets get up into space, they're generally using pretty low power thrusters just to move themselves around a little bit. But most of the energy for movement through space is by taking advantage of gravitational fields. By a lot of the satellites that we send out, we slingshot them around the moon or around the Earth. We build up enough momentum by utilizing the gravitational field, the orbital characteristics of the gravitational field, and then we sling these things out into space. And utilizing that method, for example, under the current technology, to say get from the Earth to Mars could take upwards of 6 months using that method. Largely because, well, the reason why you can't just keep burning chemical fuel with a constant acceleration, meaning that you're creating an artificial gravity in the ship. So gravity is a force, it's an accelerated force. Things are accelerated towards the center of gravity. To overcome gravity, you have to use a greater force of acceleration, which is greater than 9.8 meters per second squared. Now, the reason why you couldn't maintain that with chemical rockets all the way from here to Mars is because the amount of fuel that you would have, of chemical fuel, of liquid oxygen and hydrogen fuel, that you would have to have on a tank to support constant acceleration from here to Mars, is a fuel tank which is literally on the orders of magnitude of the size of the Earth itself. So it's a ridiculous impossibility. But with fusion, it now becomes a reality, because, and I'll just show this graphic to give a sense of the kind of scale on some of these things. A lot of people may have seen this before, but just if you look at the at the top there, the comparison of the density of energy per pound that you get from these fuels as opposed to other fuels. So you see wood, coal, petroleum, 6.4 kilowatt hours per pound. And liquid oxygen, hydrogen, what they use for chemical rockets is, maybe at best you're going to be an order of magnitude above petroleum, but it's in that same range. So compare 6.4 kilowatt hours per pound to what you have with, just say, deuterium, which is 40 million kilowatt hours per pound. And so for the same pound of petroleum, say, you're getting 6 kilowatt hours. For a pound of deuterium, you're getting 40 million. And it's because of this higher energy flux density that you get with fusion, which makes it something which is able to be used for something like constant acceleration, to where by accelerating your rocket, say, 1 gravity acceleration, even half gravity acceleration, you could send a ship from Earth or low Earth orbit to Mars in the matter of days or a week or so, as opposed to 6 months or what have you. So it completely changes the time relationships among nations, nations, but also among planets, among everything in the solar system. Right? The solar system now becomes something which is accessible in reasonable time frames for human beings. And it's, think about it, it's the kind of changes in space-time relations that, say, mankind went through whenever we did first discover the use of combustion. Right? I mean, you think about just silly things of, the time difference of how long does it take to, feed your horse in the morning before you can leave for work versus the time it takes is go to the gas station, fill up on gas. It's a completely different process, right? Your whole relationship to the world around you changes whenever you introduce these new higher energy flux dense technologies. The time it takes to get from point A to point B, not only is it quicker, but the way you think about your relationship to the world and the universe around you changes. Right? A trip from New York to LA is no longer a life's journey, or one where you have to think about, I better have 15 kids before I leave because I know half of them are going to die on the way and what have you, to, 6-hour flight and it's kind of a pain in the ass that I got, I'm stuck in the middle seat. So you get these very different changes occur whenever you introduce some kind of new technology. And so that is the case with Helium-3. You introduce Helium-3, you're now changing all our relationships to the world around us. Right? We're now producing temperatures greater than the sun. So that which has been the source of energy to fuel the development of the biosphere, which has been the driver for forming everything here on Earth, we're now able to supersede in terms of power density, in terms of temperature. Places like Mars, which are, seem so far away, which right now it's not even realistic to send human beings to because the time of the flight is so long. The radiation exposure in that length of flight is so dangerous. It's just not realistic. All of a sudden, Mars just becomes another neighbor. Everything starts to change. The idea of what is possible in terms of manufacturing now changes. The level of precision that you can achieve becomes, because it's nonlinear. So you get all these kinds of qualitative nonlinear changes now start to occur when you introduce this higher platform. Everything about how we relate to the universe is now inverted. The solar system as a whole now becomes the workable domain of mankind. And I think that starts to get at the kind of thing Mr. LaRouche is referring to when he talks about Kepler as being really the key to this whole thing, this relationship of Kepler to the Helium-3 process. Kepler was the first one to really give us an idea of the solar system, as a one, something which could be understood as a one in the mind of man. Man could now see the solar system as bound by a certain set of harmonic principles. Now, with the utilization of helium-3 and the kind of technologies that affords us, now, in an even greater way, the solar system now becomes our domain. It becomes a domain which we are now able to physically act in and change and transform. Not just react to, not just understand, but actually start to change and act on it. And so that's going to be a profound transformation for mankind. No longer will mankind simply be Earthlings, we'll now be Solarians, as Kraft Erika would talk about. We'll become a species of the solar system. And eventually, as we can develop even higher fuels like matter-antimatter propulsion systems and that kind of power, we'll be able to go beyond the solar system and start to explore the galaxy at an even greater rate. So that's the kind of future which is now being brought into existence by this move towards the utilization of helium-3 for fusion. And it's not just a pie-in-the-sky idea. This is something which is now becoming a living reality. And so let's get into some of that, and that's a lot of what's in the paper, which is available on the Rouge Pub website, the EIR website, and also it should be, I'm hoping in the near term, it should be up on the LPAC site too, so everyone will be able, if you haven't already, will be able to access it. So what really was the breakthrough? What was the change in terms of helium-3 becoming again the focal point of this new world system? Well, it has to do with what China did. In December of 2013, China did a soft landing on the moon and deployed the U-2 rover. U-2 is Chinese for Jade Rabbit, and this is part of what are known as their Chang'e missions. And this is, it's based in Chinese folklore of the god of the moon, and U-2 was the god's pet, this little pet rabbit. So they sent this pet rabbit in the form of a rover up to the moon to be with its goddess. So they landed on the moon. First time anyone had put anything on the moon in quite some time, and it was a real achievement on the part of the Chinese. And so the question was, well, what's the plan here? What's the long-term intention of the Chinese? And so they started to make it very clear that their intention was not simply just to make a statement. They weren't just intending to go to the moon to plant a flag or to, paint it red or something like that. But they actually have a real mission for mankind in mind whenever they're doing this. And so here's a quote from the guy who's named the father of the Chinese moon program, this guy Ouyang Ziyang, who in the interviews he talks about, he'd been fascinated with the moon his entire life since he was a little kid, of just looking at the moon and thinking about, and then seeing all these craters and wondering, why does the moon have all these craters, but we don't have craters here, and what's going on? He's always fascinated with it. Got into space science, and he kept really just pushing the Chinese government to say, look, we've got to get a first world space program going. This is the future of mankind. And the government eventually saw that, and in the 1990s, or in 2004, he started lobbying them in the 90s, pushing this. In 2004, the Chinese government said, okay, let's go with a moon program. And so they landed this, culminated, at least the first punctuation on this process, came last December with the landing of this rover on the moon. And so when interviewed about what are the long-term intentions, what is China up to here, here's what Ouyang Ziyang said. He said, the moon has huge reserves of metals such as iron. Also, helium-3, an isotope of the element helium. It is an ideal fuel for nuclear fusion power, the next generation of nuclear power. It is estimated that reserves of helium-3 across Earth amount to just 15 tons, while 100 tons of helium-3 will be needed each year if nuclear fusion technology is applied to meet global energy demands. The moon, on the other hand, has reserves estimated at between 1 and 5 million tons. He goes on, the moon is full of resources, mainly rare earth elements, titanium, uranium, which the Earth is really short of. And these resources can be used without limitation. There are so many potential developments, it's beautiful. So we hope we can fully utilize the moon to support sustainable development for humans and society. So he said it very clearly. We are going to the moon because the future of mankind depends on it. Now, the reason why the moon has such large reserves of helium-3 and the Earth doesn't has everything to do with the sun itself. Helium-3 is a product of the sun, and the sun sends it out in its solar, its solar wind. Now, a lot of it gets blocked from coming to Earth because of our magnetic field. So it gets deflected away from coming to Earth, and there's just a very scarce amount, as he said, about 15 tons on the whole planet Earth. The moon obviously doesn't have that problem. It doesn't have a magnetic field to shield it. It's constantly being also hit by cosmic radiation, which may be also creating more helium-3 there. So there's been, over the course of billions of years, there's been built up on the moon a large reserve of this helium-3, estimated at between 100 and 500 million tons. And as he said, 1 million tons is what will be required to meet current global energy needs. Now, of course, as the world develops, those global energy needs are gonna multiply. But nonetheless, as Bill referenced in the beginning, conservative estimates are that there's about 10,000 years worth of energy reserve in helium-3 there on the moon. And so this is what China's doing. China has made it very clear we're going to the moon to industrialize it and develop it. So they've now, because of the success of the Chang'e 3 mission, they've just announced that towards the end of this year they're going to have the Chang'e 4 mission, which will be a mission to basically send a craft around the moon and back to re-enter Earth to test their re-entry capabilities. They want to see, are we able to bring something from the moon back to Earth? And that'll be a tester mission for them, what they want to do in 2017 with the Chang'e 5 mission, which is to have a sample return. They want to land something on the moon, pick up a bunch of regolith or moon soil, and bring it back to Earth to test it to really start to get more precisely a sense of the density and concentrations of helium-3 and other rare earth elements. So they're putting forward a very clear plan with a timetable and with the funding. That's the important thing. They're getting the funding, they're getting the government support to do this, and it's really becoming the centerpiece of their national mission. Now, in conjunction with this, they've also been developing things like, as I report in the paper, is what they're building what they call the Lunar Palace, which they're starting to develop capabilities for what will be eventually a base on the moon, an industrial base and habitats for human beings on the moon. And so they just completed a several hundred-day test about a month ago, where they had these astronauts in there figuring out how they're going to live off the land on the moon, how to recycle their water. They're growing these weird kinds of high-protein worms. So, not everything about being an astronaut is all candy, but so they're going to be eating these high-protein worms and other things. But, they're making it very clear, this is where we're going. This is our orientation. We're going to the moon. We're going to industrialize it. We're going to be setting up bases of operation, working there, and we're going to be mining it for helium-3. Now, the other thing is because, as I mentioned, it's not just helium-3, but there's a lot of iron also on the moon. Then there's titanium. There's other scarce resources. So the moon, for other reasons, because of the resources and now also the power supply, is also an ideal place, not just for mining of resource to bring back to Earth for energy, but for the mining and utilizing of the resources there on the moon itself for the building of ships and other things to be sent out into space. And so, because obviously the moon has 1/6 the gravity of Earth, things move a lot better. There's you don't have to overcome the same amount of resistance that you do on Earth in terms of gravitational resistance. There's also the fact that it's a near vacuum, so it's ideal for things like 3D printing processes, which depend on a vacuum chamber to do their kinds of 3D printing. There's other types of the low gravity also is good for certain types of manufacturing, where the low gravity allows you to get more consistent types of settling of materials. So it's an ideal place to have bases of manufacturing to then send ships out to other parts of the solar system and the galaxy. And then with the Helium-3, you obviously have the power source both to run the equipment, but then also the power source for the propulsion system of the rockets themselves. So that's what they're doing. That's what China's doing. Now they're doing this, as I said, in the context of not simply just running the same kind of cheap labor economy that they had been running. And this is, again, one of the mistakes and just the ignorant arrogance of the West. In that same speech where Obama was going after the Russians and making fun of the fact that they only live to be 60 years old and they don't produce anything. In that same one he said about China, yeah, you got to be tough with China. You got to let them show them who's boss. They're not big on ideas. They're not big on abstractions. But tough talk, that's how you put them in line. And then he said China, they're just a place for cheap manufacturing. Well, the reality is China is now becoming the world leader in the production and export of high-end, first-level technology of high-speed rail. So as I mentioned, Argentina is now importing high-speed rail from China. China's building the Eurasian land bridge corridors, high-speed rail connecting from Asia through Eurasia into Europe, opening up whole new trade corridors along which there will be development corridors of manufacturing, mining, what have you. They've also been setting up agreements with Africa, which I think is pretty amazing given what Africa has suffered under the hands of colonialism. China is planning to build, by the year 2020, 80,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in Africa. And what China said was that we want to link all of the capitals of all the nations in Africa with high-speed rail, which is the complete opposite of what has been the colonial policy. And a lot of people don't realize that, yes, the colonial powers built some rail in Africa, but they built it specifically from the mines to the ports. And the rail lines between countries were all of different gauges. So the same kind of gauging, meaning the distancing of the tracks. And so in one country, the distancing between the rails is one. In another country, it's different, which was intentionally set up so that there was no ability to internally link up the rail networks. It was intentionally devised so there'd be no integration of the nations of Africa, that would only exist as a place for the export and looting of resources. We now see the kinds of effects that colonial policy has had with the massive outbreak of Ebola on top of everything else that's been so horrific on that continent. And so Africa is now saying the total opposite. 80,000 kilometers of high-speed rail linking up the nations and really helping Africa emerge again as part of this new kind of economic order in the world. And so China, while being motivated and driven by this front-end perspective of Helium-3 development, is also simultaneously building up, using currently available technologies on a global scale, all kinds of industry and development, and facilitating that on a global basis. Now they're also really pushing the world forward and leading the world to a large extent in the area of fusion itself. So while they're going to the moon to develop it and looking for the Helium-3, they're also here now developing the fusion capability to utilize that Helium-3. So China now is one of only 2 nations in the world which has a tokamak reactor which utilizes superconductive magnets, meaning magnets which are cold to near zero temperature, which allows for almost frictionless flow of current through the material, which then produces a very high magnetic field, which is important whenever you're trying to contain these very hot plasmas. The higher the magnetic field, at least in terms of the conventional approach, the higher magnetic field, the greater the containment you can get of the plasma. And that's the key, is you want to be able to contain the plasma long enough to get it hot enough to get enough fusion to take place for it to be a viable energy source. So they're one of only two places in the world, the other one being South Korea, which have superconductive tokamaks. They've also been engaged in a very fruitful exchange with many of the scientists here in the United States. Now, people shouldn't get it twisted in a certain way. While China is moving forward in this way, to a large extent, they've been able to move forward through the collaboration with the United States, where all of the initial breakthroughs on these ideas occurred here. So, for example, they've been working closely with people in San Diego at General Atomics, where they also have a tokamak reactor and a fusion test facility. The achievements they realized at General Atomics, where a number of Chinese scientists were in the U.S. working, those breakthroughs were then taken back to China and then applied to the super tokamak reactor, the superconductive tokamak reactor, which then allowed China to realize the highest confinement time yet in the world. So certain discoveries that were made in collaboration with the U.S. were brought to China, applied there, and they were able to achieve a world record-setting confinement time for this plasma. And you've had a couple of breakthroughs of that type, which have occurred as a result of this U.S.-China collaboration. The difference between the U.S. and China right now is the commitment. You look at what's happening with the U.S. fusion budget. It's being slashed. Right? You had this situation where the U.S. has committed a certain amount of money to the ITER project, the International Tokamak Experimental Reactor, which is being built in France, and which has Russia, China, India, U.S., the European Union. A bunch of nations are all contributing to this, what will be the biggest tokamak experiment in the world. So they're contributing. So the U.S. is contributing resources and money to that, but there's been this ongoing debate in Congress, and every budget it kind of flips, where they'll say, okay, well, to meet our obligations for ITER, we're going to have to cut funding to our domestic program. So the fusion program at MIT was being cut. The fusion program at the University of San Diego was being cut. Then there was a counterfight that came back, led by certain senators like Elizabeth Warren, among others, who said, this is crazy, don't cut the MIT program, let's get the funding. So they got the funding back for MIT, but at the expense then of ITER. So we took the money away from what we were going to give to ITER and gave it to MIT to keep it going. So it just shows the kind of insanity where, we're talking, relative peanuts when you're talking budgetary terms. We're talking, a couple $100 million, which when you compare that to the scale of things like the amount of money that went into the bailout or the amount of money that's been pumped into these derivatives, when you're talking about trillions of dollars and derivatives contracts that are supposed to be valued at quadrillions of dollars. A couple $100 million, billions of dollars, that's nothing. But yet there's a fight around that, budget fight around it, which really is only indicative of the fact that there's been an intention, as some people may have seen an article from Megan Beats, there's been an intention to suppress and destroy the development of fusion. So while we're doing that in the U.S., China's moving forward. It's gotten so bad that, and we went and actually visited the facility at Princeton. It's the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, where they've been one of the world leaders in tokamak breakthroughs and understanding. They had a new design, what's known as a stellarator, which instead of just having a simple donut-shaped plasma, has a twisted plasma. It's kind of twisted, knotted, and it's a shape, a twisted kind of pretzel-y shape. And the shape, they came up with that shape by looking at what are all the, they used about 43 different parameters, is what they told us, of different things like magnetic strength, how the plasma likes to move. So they created a machine that would produce a plasma that was shaped in a way which was harmonic with how the plasma likes to act. so it's potentially a more advanced design than even the tokamak. They had this thing all built. They built all the components. They got it all figured out, and it's in 3 big pieces. So they got up to where they got 3 large pieces that they built for this machine, and it's just a matter of now putting them together. You have to put them together, and there's a lot of obviously complex engineering involved. But they were $100 million short of being able to put this thing together. After investing years and a lot of money into getting this thing, $100 million away from being able to just put it together, fire this thing up, and see if see where this takes us. They couldn't get the $100 million. Their funding, they lost the funding for it. China then turned around and said, "Hey, this is an awesome experiment. There's a lot of potential that can come out of this. We'll give you $50 million if you can get the rest. We'll just outright give you half. You guys come up with the rest, and we'll obviously collaborate and work on it." The guys at Princeton had to come back and say, sorry, we can't even get the $50 million. At which point the Chinese said, oh, well, then how about this? Why don't you send we'll pay to have all the pieces shipped over here to China, and we'll pay to put the thing together for you, and we'll run it here. But of course, they said no. They're holding out hope that eventually they will get the funding here. But it just shows you the difference in mentality, the difference in orientation of where things are going. So that's China. They're moving forward with that. Now, we started to look at more recently than Russia. What's Russia doing? What's their space program? And so, similarly, in April, there was a document leaked to a Russian newspaper on the future Russian space program, the future of Russia's space program. And what it laid out in detail was that Russia also has a plan that starting in 2016, they're going to have 4 missions to land also robotic rovers on the moon, eventually culminating in a sample return from the moon to bring back to Russia. To then, the second phase of that is going to involve sending a manned mission to basically trail the moon to go into the moon's orbit, and then a third mission to send a man to the moon to where they'll start surveying the moon to find the ideal site to start to set up an industrial base. They also said in 2018 they're going to start investing into the building of the prototype base that they want to build on the moon. And this will include the development of certain types of crane technology, digging technologies, and the like. And so they've put forward this very aggressive plan for space development and moon industrialization. And this came out of Roscosmos, the Russian equivalent of NASA, and the Russian Academy of Sciences and others wrote this proposal. They then asked the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, Dmitry Rogozin, who's the Deputy Prime Minister for Space and Defense. They said, well, what is this report legitimate? What's up? And he said, yes. He said, our plan is to go to the moon forever. Making the point, we're not just going there as the show, we are going to the moon to develop it. And so the Russians are also making it clear, this is our intention. And if people go back, you can see there's actually a video which is very, very worth watching called, I think it's just called Mining the Moon for Helium-3, which goes through the Russians going back to 2006. Also had a number of leading people in Russia who were pushing for the idea of mining the moon for Helium-3 for the use as a fusion power energy source. So the Russians also have this perspective. Now the thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. could be leading the way on this. The irony is that the way in which the world is now moving in terms of this kind of national banking approach, the new development bank, the types of mechanisms they're now employing in Egypt for the construction of the canal, that type of economic model, which is now being employed by these nations, is in fact the American system model. It's the system set up by people like Hamilton, developed by Hamilton, furthered by people like Henry Carey, employed by the likes of Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt for things like the development of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Four Corners Project in the U.S., the rural electrification. Right? This is the American model. Long-term credit used through a national banking system to finance large infrastructure projects, where effectively you're saying the money today comes from, the credit today comes from where we know we're going to be in the future. That in effect you're creating credit now based off of where you know you'll be in the future as you use that credit to direct the flow of resources, manpower, technology towards these kinds of ends. And so this is the system being employed by nations around the globe as the alternative to the London Wall Street system. Also, that front-end technology and that insight itself has its origins here in the United States. The discovery of helium-3 on the moon came from Apollo astronauts. And the one who really pushed it forward was Harrison Schmitt. He was on the last Apollo mission, Apollo 17, I believe it was, former U.S. Senator. He's the one who really got the idea that, hey, this helium-3 that's on the moon, we could use this. Because he had been in talks with people at University of Wisconsin in Madison, where they have a fusion energy institute. And this guy, Dr. Kolchinsky, who himself had been, he's a fusion scientist. He'd been working on development of fusion, and figured out that, hey, helium-3 is actually a really good fuel for fusion. It would actually be the best in terms of, as I discussed, some of these reaction products. But he's like, there's just not a whole lot of it. Harrison Schmitt comes along and says, hey, guess what? On the moon, there's tons of it. There's hundreds of millions of tons of it on the moon. And so they got together and they really started mapping this thing out and really developing a very thorough idea of how you could take advantage of this stuff. And so they mapped out and came up with an understanding of exactly how much is on the moon. They started to develop all types of designs and conceptions on how you would mine the moon, how to dig up the regolith, how to separate out the helium-3, how to then also take advantage of the other materials that are yet there, how to utilize the oxygen that's there. Kolchinsky has been working on a inertial electroconfinement reactor, which is a different one. It uses basically electrostatic differentials to bring the helium together to get fusion. But he's been working on a reactor to utilize specifically helium-3 for fusion. And this is actually the technology and the insights which the Chinese, the Russians, and others are picking up on. It's coming from leading thinkers in the United States. And so we have right here in our own midst and in our own history the actual roadmap for this kind of new world development, for this kind of this evolutionary upward shift for mankind. But we're not doing it. All right, right now, the U.S. has a vacuum of leadership. Right, you think the vacuum on the moon is strong. Think about the vacuum that occurs in Congress. I mean, there's nothing there. And so that becomes now our job. Our job now is to move the United States to orient itself towards what really should be its natural partners: Russia, China, India, the BRICS nations. And as has come out, and this mention this as a last point, as has come out in the last days, and Mr. LaRouche referenced this yesterday in the webcast, and again today in discussion with associates, there are now in the United States emerging or coming, in discussion with us, high-level people in government and in the domain of economy who realize that what Mr. LaRouche is saying is in fact right, who are themselves taking steps to cut the legs off from underneath the London Wall Street system, are working with us to start to move towards redefining this new idea of value. The idea that value is not something which is nominal as a monetary thing. Value is not something which is arbitrary. But value is a function of the future. The future is what determines value. Helium-3 has value because man's mind has had leaps of insight in understanding of how to use helium-3 to produce abundant amounts of energy. Man has had insights to develop technologies that can utilize the protons for manufacturing and for medical purposes. Right? Helium-3 has value because of the creative insights of the human mind, and because of the necessary use of helium-3 to create this kind of bright future. That's value. That's where value comes from. Value does not come from the markets. Value does not come from a hedonistic index. Value comes from creativity. Value is defined by the future for man. And so now there are moves afoot among leading institutions in the United States to start to move the U.S. in that direction, to bankrupt Wall Street in a controlled way and to replace it with this kind of helium-3 driver. And what they're asking us is, as one of these top DC contacts we have said to another of our associates, Mr. LaRouche is the only person in the United States with the kind of stature and track record to be able to push this policy. He's the guy that can do this. And so that is our mission now. We're going full-fledged with pushing this helium-3 platform. That helium-3 is the new reality for mankind. China's doing it. Russia's orienting towards it. The rest of the world is being brought along with it, with this perspective. And it's now up to us to move the U.S. in line with those nations. Because if we don't, we see the alternative. We see what the other intention is. Provoke Russia, provoke China, allow chaos to spread in the Middle East, allow genocide to sweep through Africa, allow diseases like Ebola to wipe out large swaths of population on the planet. That's the Dark Age alternative, which is occurring and is growing as a reality, but for this alternative, and it will be the dominant reality if we don't get the U.S. on board with really the U.S.'s own charter, so to speak, to get the U.S. back to its founding intention and join the world for this helium-3 perspective, for this man's conquering of the solar system. So I'll leave it at that and take some questions if there are any.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Okay, I think we have some. Jim, you got a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Talk loud and.
Mr. Jones?
Kind of.
Based on, thank you for the presentation, it was tremendous. The thoughts I've gone through as you spoke on the different aspects of the helium-3 program and the future development, it seems to me that through development of plasma physics, eventually, here on Earth, they could develop a commercial way of producing helium-3, and as we become Solarians, as you put it, moving out, it seems to me that there are many other bodies, such as moons of the other planets, that could also be like our moon in having the abundance of helium-3 and the metals you talked about for, development in the solar system, industrializing, etc. Give us your thoughts on that, and then would you expound a little bit on matter, antimatter? That's pretty confusing to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah. There is, first off, yes, there are indications that there's helium-3 does exist on other moons, as you indicated. I don't have the specifics on the amounts. I think some of that's going to be, we have a report, it's going to be a more complete report on this whole helium-3 perspective that's coming out within the next weeks, I believe. But anyways, yes, I think, don't quote me on this, but maybe on Titan or something, there are indications that there is helium-3 there. And it is somewhat relative, to the moon and things. Yeah, there is some abundance of it out there. And it's just a matter of getting out and exploring and finding it. I mean, the thing is, the reason why we know there's so much of it on the moon is because we actually went there and we picked up some stuff and we brought it home, we analyzed it and discovered it. So, you know, there's a lot probably out there that we're just not aware of because we're not going out there and doing anything about it. The production of helium-3 itself is possible. I mean, it can be bred in other types of fusion reactors. This is something that actually Kraft Erica, in one of his essays on lunar development, I think it was written in 1986. I think it was prior to them really knowing that helium-3 existed on the moon in abundance itself. He actually had an idea that you could have deuterium-tritium fusion reactors on the moon, and that the product of that, I think it was the, I forget which, but anyways, the product of that will itself, I think he said in 12 years or so, it will decay down into helium-3. And so he had a whole plan for how you could, having about a 12-year perspective, in using deuterium and tritium for fusion, you would also be producing as a byproduct something which would itself degrade eventually down into helium-3, which then could be used for the next generation fusion reactor. So there are ways in which you can produce helium-3. It's just not easy. I mean, most of the helium-3 that we have here on Earth now that we use for, it is used for certain medical purposes, for imaging purposes, comes from depleted nuclear fuels. I think I don't know if it comes from a lithium reaction. Anyways, don't quote. But we are able to get some through the breakdown of nuclear waste. So that's how we get some of this, what we have here on Earth. But it's a very small amount. On the matter-antimatter, it is, and I'll show it's. I'll show this image again. But you see, just in terms of the actual energy density of it, so if deuterium is 40 million kilowatt hours a pound, antimatter is 1.14 billion kilowatt hours per pound. So it's a couple of orders of magnitude greater than even fusion power. Now at current, matter-antimatter is very hard to come by. Mostly we have some because we're able to produce it in these large particle accelerators, where you're smashing these particles together, they're shooting off gamma rays, those gamma rays are then degenerating down into a electron and a positron, and so we're able to get some antimatter that way. We've also found that there is antimatter in the radiation belts around the Earth. The Van Allen belts also have antimatter in it. There have been some proposals for being able to go out and basically mine the radiation belts for antimatter. We could sweep this stuff up using certain types of technologies. There's also indicates there might be a lot of it. I think it's on Saturn. We may have a lot of antimatter, relative abundant amounts of antimatter. But eventually, yes, we would have to figure out how to produce antimatter in abundance. Now, with antimatter, what you're getting is really a full conversion, more or less, of matter to energy, according to Einstein's equals mc squared. So yeah, you bring together a little bit of matter, a little bit of antimatter, they annihilate each other, and they release a lot of energy, largely in the form of gamma rays, which then we just have to figure out how to harness them. So there are technologies, there are people, there are scientists at JPL that we've been in touch with and elsewhere who are actually developing technologies to use antimatter as a propulsion fuel, where because it's even denser than even fusion fuel in terms of the amount of energy you get out of it, you can have an even further expanse for space travel, because that's one of your limits for space travel is you got to have the fuel. The fuel you're going to use is pretty much the fuel you're taking with you. So the denser the fuel, the more you can hold in terms of the energy equivalent that you can hold per mass of fuel. So matter-antimatter reactions are going to be crucial for us even going beyond the solar system and really getting out and having a galactic effect. So it's in the process, but it's still, like all these things, the funding's not there, and it's sort of still on the fringe. But I think that's the next step. That's the next thing we want to promote. And the reality is, once you get fusion, a fusion-based economy, you're now going to be able to create the kinds of conditions required for the production of antimatter. So another place where it's produced is in these very high-energy lasers, or these high-power lasers, these petawatt lasers, which are able to take, some tens of joules of energy, but expend them over millionths of a billionth of a second. So over the time span of a millionth of a billionth of a second, they're able to release some number of joules of energy, but that produces power which is 2,000 times greater than the power of the entire electrical grid of the United States. So these lasers in this short shot are able to take 2,000 times the power of the entire U.S. electric grid and concentrate it on something, about the size of a dime. And when they do that, that creates all kinds of wild effects, one of which is it accelerates electrons and then which deflects other things, which then produces gamma rays, which themselves degenerate down into antimatter. They've been able to produce antimatter using these lasers, as well as be able to transmute one element, and there's all kinds of wild things that can be done with that. So that's another technology that's part of this high energy density physics platform. High energy dense plasmas, fusion processes, these high energy lasers, where you're tapping into whole different domains of reality that were otherwise inaccessible. Where you get this very interesting kind of relationship between very small and the very large, where it's the further we're able to penetrate into matter gives us a greater power to go further and further out into the universe. So just like as we move from burning of wood, which is, a material process, to then being able to process and burn petroleum, which is a chemical process. We went deeper into matter. That gave us a new power. We then were able to penetrate the molecular level to the atomic level with atomic power. That gives us another level of being able to expand and increase our power in the universe. We go beyond that to the subatomic with fusion and actually dealing with the nucleus. That's a whole nother level. Then when you go to matter-antimatter, you're now talking about another couple of orders of magnitude of power. And so whenever we do these things, we're now able to create powers and temperatures and speeds and things which were otherwise literally impossibly far away under the lower technology regime. So that's exactly where we need to push things.
Okay, I got a question. How much do we know about what exactly the mining of helium-3 is going to look like? I mean, are we talking about a substance that exists in a gas state? Okay, and if that's the case,
yeah, sort of trapped. It's trapped in little, I guess, like gas bubbles, or I don't know if it's sort of trapped in the soil, in the lunar soil. Yeah.
Okay, so do we know what that process of extraction is going to look like, or is it sort of that's part of the figuring out the process, getting up there and?
Yeah, they're actually, again, at the University of Wisconsin. Oh, and this would be a good time to show this, in fact. People can see that. This is the cover of a 21st Century magazine from 1990. Oh, Mining the Moon. I'm going to say, Mining the Moon to Power the Earth. And in this is a whole article based off of the work that's going on there at the University of Wisconsin on being able to mine the moon for helium-3 specifically, as well as other resources. On the cover there is you see an old school computer graphic of the miner which they had developed. So they have pretty detailed blueprints for the kind of miner that would be used in terms of how it would dig up the soil, process it, heat it, and then basically I think what they're doing is they're going to heat the soil, then you'll be able to, well, if you turn the soil into a plasma, if you heat it enough up into a plasma where it's all now charged particles, you can then do electromagnetic separation of the different elements out of that plasma. So you can extract exclusively the helium, the hydrogen, the oxygen, the iron, what have you. And so they've got details for this stuff. They've got all kinds of wild ideas. You'll see in this report that comes out, we go through more detail on exactly what mining the moon would mean and what it entails. It's funny because there are certain properties about the lunar soil which whenever you heat it, and they tested, they just put some in the microwave to see what would happen. It turns into basically this kind of very shiny, hard glass. And so one of the ideas is that you would take basically a kind of like a harvester, but it would have large microwave beams on it, and you would basically microwave large strips of area on the moon and turn them into very smooth landing pads. Where you could then do this inside of craters and turn craters into very large telescopes, into very smooth, large telescopes. And so there's all kinds of unique properties about the soil on the moon because of just the unique conditions there, where it has all these properties you just don't find in any kind of soil here on Earth. But they've been, since the Apollo missions, there's been a small group of scientists who have been just continually working and looking at the lunar soil and figuring out the different properties, how to extract it, how to utilize it. So I think in blueprint form, at least, all these technologies exist. Obviously now it's just a matter of getting the real industrial thrust to start producing these things and making this part of what should be a new Apollo level of mission. There's one other thing on that. What was I going to say? Yeah, never mind. I forget what I was going to say. But yeah, we know how to do it. It's been worked on, and yeah, it's just a matter of doing it, really. All right. Anything else?
Yeah. Back a little bit in history, I believe it was, at the conference of Rambouillet, George Shultz had attended that, and that's where the idea of floating exchange rates came out. Nixon had already taken us off the gold-based standard. What is the background with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund? I know that at Bretton Woods conferences, that these were the designs Roosevelt wanted to bring in for the reconstruction of the world after the war. But wasn't it through the Bank of International Settlements and the things that took place in the 70s that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund got broken down in doing what they did to enslave the countries, third world countries, economically or financially? And do you think that these two entities are salvageable, or should we pursue like what the BRICS countries are doing as far as development banks and like Egypt doing? We would have a national bank in our country. Your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, those institutions are fundamentally bankrupt. And they should be put through a bankruptcy, and actually there should probably be a lot of criminal charges brought against leading current and former employees of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, because they have been intentionally instruments for the enslaving and destruction of nations. That's effectively what their role has been, is to force nations into a kind of debt slavery. Then once they're in that debt slavery, they use the conditions that are then set up for nations to get out of that debt are genocidal, they basically force them to take suicidal actions, like selling off their national industries, or they're selling off their resources and this kind of thing. But yeah, I think it really broke. I think it was already crumbling even in the 60s, but it really broke in the 70s, as you indicated. And this was actually one of the things that in 1971 really put Mr. LaRouche on the map internationally as an economist, whenever he forecast that the Bretton Woods system was going to collapse, because he saw the way that the debt bubbles were being created and leveraged under that system, that to maintain it, they would have to destroy the Bretton Woods system and eliminate the fixed exchange rate system of Bretton Woods, which they did, and move towards a floating exchange rate system, which just opened up the world to the idea where now currency itself, money for the sake of money, became the economy. We were now speculating on the changes in relationships among currencies, and that now became, you know, a market in and of itself. And so it was really at that point that, you know, they really unleashed this wave of speculation on the world, was in that 1971 period, whenever Nixon announced the end of the Bretton Woods system and launched the whole idea of the floating exchange rate currency policy. Now, it's something Mr. LaRouche had warned about. People thought, no, that's never going to happen. When it did, it sort of put him on the international stage and really put him in a position where he now became public enemy number one of the likes of people like George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and the like. So yeah, so now the point is, forget those institutions. This is what's at the center of Mr. LaRouche's 4 points. Really, the 4 laws of economy are this moving now for the immediate implementation of the Glass-Steagall standard, banking separation, separating commercial from investment banking, back to what we had under Franklin Roosevelt, to be able to then filter out all this bad debt and unpayable debt and speculative nonsense, eliminate it, save what's worth saving, then reorganize the banking system and go back to a national bank, get rid of the Federal Reserve, which is really just a private central banking type of policy, go back to the Hamiltonian system of national banking, constitutional idea of the Congress as being that body which is able to create and disseminate credit, national banking, then through the national bank disseminate large amounts of low-interest long-term credit to finance big infrastructure projects. Think big water projects, rail projects, power projects, the moon project, these kinds of things. And to do all this with an eye on and really being driven by the ultimate focus of developing a full-blown fusion economy. That all this will be vectored towards creating the conditions and moving the world towards realizing this promise of Helium-3 on the moon. And so that's the direction we want to go. National banking, long-term credit, and doing it all oriented towards this kind of future-oriented fusion Helium-3 economy.
Anything else? You might have covered this. I had to leave the room for a minute, but I remember about 2 years ago, Lynn was discussing that a fusion rocket program to Mars would create a Pearl Harbor effect amongst the American population, and it seems to me that he's basically saying the same thing now in terms of, to the extent that we can get people to understand what China's doing and how we can be a part of it. If you were to have a discussion about that with a politician or anybody else who, let's say, is involved in a policy fight, and if you were to try to get them to understand that that's true, that these Pearl Harbor moments can be created around fusion, how would you help them understand that?
Well, I guess in terms of, part of the reason why I had written this paper on what China's doing was specifically what I had in mind as an audience were these various politicians in the Congress and elsewhere who otherwise totally have their head up their ass, are really out to lunch on what reality is. And so part of the idea was to demonstrate to them in no uncertain terms that this is where the rest of the world is going. That we're no longer in a place where, even if you're going to continue to be an asshole, right, Mr. Congressman, you're going to continue to be a jerk, you're going to continue to be a bigot and a jingoist and all that kind of stuff, at least recognize that the United States is not going to survive under this current system. Whether you like China or not, you need to realize that there is a new system emerging. that there is a new alternative emerging. And so we're no longer in a unipolar world where the U.S. or the London Wall Street system can just say, screw everyone else, who cares if it's even hurting us here, we're still on top. We're the only show in town, so to speak. Which is the way, the way that a lot of these guys think. So they think, hey, we're the biggest, we're the baddest, we can do what we want. Whatever we think is right today is what we can impose on the rest of the world, and no one can do anything about it because no one has the power that we have. No one has, what we've got here in the United States. So the idea is to demonstrate to them that no, that game has changed. The world is moving in a completely different direction. China has made it very clear this is their intention. They're intending to move into the 21st century with the most advanced technologies and the most advanced power systems, and they're doing it. Russia's on board with them. India is getting on board with them. The rest of the world, or much of the world, is moving in that direction too. So if you want to see the United States survive, if you want to see a future for your children and grandchildren, you've got to get the United States on board with this program because this is where the world's going. It's not just, as it may have been even 10 years ago. It's not just, here's a good idea. The world is all controlled by this one system, this one idea. Here's another idea which is good. Can we find some people with the moral gumption to do what's right? Now it's a point where this is a physical reality. This is what's really going on in the world. If the U.S. is going to survive, they've got to get on board with this. It's not just a dream any longer. And so, I think you really have to, ultimately you want to find those politicians who are drawn to this because of the moral implications of it, because of the excitement of what the future could be in a Helium-3 economy. But to the extent that, they're just sort of a simple immoral bastard, as many of them are, you can also kind of kick them in the butt or scare the hell out of them about where the rest of the world is going and how the U.S. is going to be left behind if we don't get on track with this. One thing I didn't mention, but it's in the article. Look, China announced a couple years ago that they intend to graduate by the end of this decade 2,000 new fusion scientists. So while we're shutting down fusion programs here in the United States, China is saying we're going to graduate 2,000 more PhDs in fusion alone. And so that's the reality. And so the Pearl Harbor of this is that we're going to find ourselves, we're going to wake up one day, if the U.S. continues in this direction, we're going to wake up one day and the whole world is going to have left us behind, and we're going to be sitting here, and in a dry ice age or something, where the West is dead dry and the East is under a sheet of ice, and we can't figure out how to grow food or even light a fire. So that's the Pearl Harbor, is the reality that the world has now evolved an alternative. There's a real, living, growing alternative to the London Wall Street system. And if the U.S. doesn't get on board, A, it may never happen, and B, at the very least, we're going to lose everything that we've fought to establish here as a nation in the very near term.
Okay. Well, unless there's any other questions, I think that was fantastic. It really helped illustrate the shift. All right, thanks. And the paper is available on LaRouchePub.com.
Yeah, it's on LaRouchePub.com. With the I'm not sure if you have to have an EIR subscription now, but you should have one anyways if people don't. And then, it will be on the website, on the LPAC site within the next couple of days. And then we'll have, in the next week or so, a complete package. It'll have this article on China. It'll have a lot more detail on Helium-3, on fusion, on mining the moon, and then also just a broader picture of what is a fusion economy. So look for that. Will be more of, a pamphlet, 21st century type pamphlet in the next week or two.
All right, fantastic. Thank you.
All right, you guys, have fun. Good talking to you.
Yeah.